Lionel Tate was a 12-year-old boy who thought being a child meant he could never go to prison for life. This kid beat 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick to death with his bare hands, crushing her liver and fracturing her skull like she was a rag doll, then sat calm and confident in court believing his age was his ultimate shield against justice. He smirked through witness testimony, showed zero remorse when the victim's mother collapsed in tears, and maintained his innocent act right up until Judge Joel Lazarus announced his sentence. That's when Lionel's world exploded in a breakdown so violent that court officers had to physically restrain him as the reality hit. He had just become the youngest American ever sentenced to life without parole, and his childhood was officially over forever. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. Lionel didn't just kill once and learn his lesson. After getting a second chance at freedom, he threw it all away with another violent crime that sent him back to prison for 3 decades. This isn't just a story about a child who made a terrible mistake. This is about a pattern of violence that started at age 12 and never stopped. Childhood destroyed forever will. You face the truth about what really happened that night in Florida and why some experts believe Lionel was already a psychopath before he could even drive. Subscribe now to unravel this nightmare that proves age doesn't always equal innocence. July 28th, 1999. A simple family babysitting arrangement in the quiet suburbs of Miramar, Florida turned into a murder scene that would horrify the nation and change juvenile justice forever. What was supposed to be a normal evening of cousins playing together became 45 minutes of systematic violence that left a 6-year-old girl dead and her family destroyed beyond repair. Lionel Alexander Tate, a 170-pound 12-year-old with a documented history of aggressive behavior towards smaller children, thought he'd committed the perfect crime. After all, who would believe that a child could be capable of such calculated brutality? He had always gotten away with hurting kids before. Teachers complained, parents worried, but nothing ever happened to him. This time was different. This time, someone was dead, and Lionel was about to learn that some crimes are so horrific, so unforgivable that even children must face adult consequences. But the real shock wasn't just the murder itself. It was what happened in that Broward County courtroom when a cocky 13-year-old boy discovered that his age couldn't save him from spending the rest of his life behind bars. The breakdown that followed would be captured on camera and broadcast around the world, showing exactly what happens when a young killer realizes he's not as untouchable as he thought. Let me paint you a complete picture of who Lionel Tate really was in the summer of 1999, because understanding his background is crucial to understanding why this tragedy was almost inevitable. This wasn't just any 12-year-old kid. At 170 pounds and nearly 6 feet tall, Lionel was built like a high school football player, towering over children his own age and especially smaller kids like his cousin Tiffany. Born January 30th, 1987, Lionel Alexander Tate grew up in what appeared to be a stable, middle-class home in South Florida. His mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, was a Florida Highway Patrol officer, someone who supposedly understood the law, understood consequences, and should have been able to recognize warning signs in her own child. His father wasn't in the picture much, leaving Kathleen to raise Lionel mostly on her own while working demanding shifts as a state trooper. But behind the facade of normalcy, there were red flags everywhere that adults chose to ignore. Teachers at Lionel's school had been complaining for months about his aggressive behavior towards smaller children. He would push kids half his size, intimidate them in hallways, and use his considerable size advantage to bully anyone he perceived as weaker. Other parents in the neighborhood had started keeping their younger children away from Lionel because they noticed how rough he was during play. The most disturbing part? Lionel seemed to enjoy having power over smaller, helpless victims. Child psychologists who later examined him described a pattern of behavior that showed he specifically targeted children who couldn't fight back. He wasn't acting out because of trauma or abuse. He was acting out because he liked being in control, liked seeing fear in other kids' eyes, liked knowing he could hurt them and they couldn't stop him. His obsession with professional wrestling made everything worse. This was the late 1990s, when WWE was at its most violent and extreme. Lionel would spend hours watching matches, studying the moves, and then practicing them on anyone smaller than him. But here's the crucial detail that would later destroy his defense. Multiple witnesses testified that Lionel knew wrestling was fake. He understood it was entertainment, not real fighting. So when he later claimed he was just innocently copying what he saw on TV, everyone who knew him knew he was lying. Kathleen Tate, despite being a law enforcement officer, seemed completely blind to her son's increasingly dangerous behavior. Maybe she was in denial, maybe she was too busy with work, or maybe she just didn't want to admit that her child was becoming something monstrous. Whatever the reason, she continued to put Lionel in situations where he had access to smaller, vulnerable children. On that fateful July evening in 1999, Kathleen made the decision that would destroy two families forever. She agreed to babysit 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick, her friend's daughter and Lionel's cousin. Tiffany was everything Lionel wasn't: small, sweet, trusting, and completely defenseless. At just 48 pounds, she was less than a third of Lionel's weight. When Kathleen left them alone together, she was essentially putting a lamb in a cage with a wolf. His choices that night weren't spontaneous or accidental. They were the inevitable result of months of escalating violence that no adult had bothered to stop. July 28, 1999, Miramar, Florida. The details of what happened that night are so disturbing, so methodical, and so brutal that they're hard to believe a 12-year-old could be responsible. But the evidence doesn't lie, and neither did Lionel's own confessions once he realized he couldn't maintain his story anymore. 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick was a tiny, precious little girl who loved dancing to music, playing with her dolls and making friendship bracelets. She had long, dark hair, bright eyes full of life, and trusted everyone around her with the innocence that only small children possess. What she didn't know was that she was spending her last night alive in a house with someone who had been secretly fantasizing about hurting children just like her for months. Here's exactly what happened, pieced together from court records, police interrogations, medical evidence, and Lionel's own changing confessions. Around 9:30 p.m., Kathleen Tate told the children she was going upstairs to her bedroom to watch television and make some phone calls. She specifically told Lionel to keep an eye on Tiffany and make sure she was safe. Those were the last instructions she gave before disappearing upstairs, completely unaware that she had just signed a little girl's death warrant. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. Lionel and Tiffany sat in the living room watching television together. But around 10 p.m., something changed in Lionel's demeanor. According to his later confessions, he started thinking about the wrestling moves he had been practicing. And he began looking at tiny Tiffany as the perfect opportunity to try them out on someone who couldn't fight back. What happened next wasn't the quick, accidental tragedy that Lionel would later claim. The medical examiner's report reveals that Tiffany suffered over 35 separate injuries to her body, indicating that this wasn't one bad move or one moment of rough play. This was systematic, prolonged violence that lasted at least 45 minutes while Kathleen remained upstairs, completely oblivious to the horror happening just one floor below. Dr. Ronald Wright, the medical examiner who performed Tiffany's autopsy, testified that her injuries were among the most severe he had ever seen in a child victim. Her liver was completely lacerated, torn apart from the inside by blunt force trauma so severe that it's usually only seen in high-speed car accidents or falls from great heights. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. 3 of her ribs were broken. She had bruising and cuts all over her small body that formed a pattern consistent with being repeatedly punched, kicked, and thrown around the room. But the most disturbing detail was what the medical evidence revealed about the timeline. Tiffany didn't die quickly. Her injuries showed that she was conscious and suffering for most of the attack. She fought back as much as a 48-pound 6-year-old could fight against a 170-pound predator, which only seemed to make Lionel more violent. Scratches on his arms and face showed that little Tiffany tried desperately to defend herself. But she never had a chance. Lionel's story about what happened that night changed every time he told it, and each version became more unbelievable than the last. Initially, he told his mother that Tiffany had fallen and hit her head on a coffee table. When that didn't explain the extent of her injuries, he changed his story to say they were wrestling and she got hurt accidentally. Then he claimed he was practicing moves he saw in WWE and things just went wrong, but investigators knew better. The evidence showed that Lionel had deliberately and methodically beaten a 6-year-old girl to death. The positioning of her body, the pattern of injuries, the timeline of events, everything pointed to murder, not an accident. Most damning of all, neighbors later testified that they heard sounds of violence coming from the Tate house that night, including what sounded like furniture being thrown and a child screaming. But no one called the police because they thought it was just rough play. When Kathleen finally came downstairs around 11:15 p.m., she found Tiffany's broken body lying motionless on the living room floor. The scene was so horrific that she initially thought there had been a break-in and attack. Blood was spattered on the walls, furniture was overturned, and this tiny little girl was clearly dead from massive trauma. But there was Lionel, standing calmly nearby, ready with his rehearsed story about how it was all just an accident. The most chilling part of the entire crime scene was Lionel's demeanor. He showed no panic, no emotion, no remorse. When paramedics arrived and began working frantically to try to save Tiffany's life, Lionel sat on the couch watching like he was observing someone else's problem. When police started asking questions, he answered with the same flat, emotionless tone he might use to describe what he had for lunch. Even more disturbing was what happened during his police interrogation. Detective Michael Denson, who interviewed Lionel that night, later testified that the boy seemed more concerned about whether he would miss school than about the fact that his cousin was dead. He asked if he could go home, complained that he was tired, and seemed genuinely surprised that people were treating this as such a big deal. It was like he couldn't understand why everyone was so upset about what he saw as just another day of play that went a little too far. Police arrested Lionel that same night, but even as they put handcuffs on him, he maintained his confidence. He had gotten away with hurting smaller kids before, and in his mind, being only 12 years old made him basically untouchable. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. When this case finally went to trial in January 2001, it became a media circus unlike anything Broward County had ever seen. The idea of a child being tried for first-degree murder was shocking enough, but the fact that prosecutors were seeking life in prison for someone who was now 13 years old made this international news. Cameras from around the world descended on Fort Lauderdale to watch history in the making. Lionel Tate walked into that courthouse with the same arrogant confidence he had maintained since the night he killed Tiffany. At 13, he had grown even bigger and more intimidating, but he still believed that his age was his ultimate protection. His defense team had spent months building their strategy around one central argument. This was just a tragic accident between children who were imitating wrestling they saw on television. But before the trial even began, prosecutors offered Lionel something that would later haunt his family forever. Ken Padowitz, the lead prosecutor, offered a plea deal that would have sentenced Lionel to just 3 years in a juvenile facility, followed by extensive probation and counseling. 3 years for beating a 6-year-old girl to death. It was an incredibly generous offer considering the severity of the crime, and it would have meant Lionel could have been free by age 16 with his entire adult life ahead of him. The decision of whether to accept that plea deal came down to a family meeting between Lionel, his mother Kathleen, and their defense attorney Jim Lewis. According to court records, Lewis strongly advised them to take the deal, warning that if they went to trial and lost, Lionel could face life in prison. But Kathleen was convinced that no jury would ever convict a child of first-degree murder. She believed that once people saw her baby boy in that courtroom, they would realize this was all just a horrible accident. Lionel himself was even more confident. He had convinced himself so completely of his own innocence that he actually wanted to go to trial. He told his lawyers that he wanted to tell his story to the jury, that he wanted to make them understand it wasn't his fault. The arrogance was breathtaking. Here was a boy who had brutally murdered his cousin, and he genuinely believed he could charm his way out of consequences. So they rejected the plea deal. It was a decision that would haunt them forever. The trial itself was a masterclass in prosecutorial precision. Ken Padowitz methodically destroyed every aspect of Lionel's defense, starting with the wrestling excuse. He brought in WWE performers who testified that their moves were carefully choreographed entertainment designed to look violent without actually causing harm. He showed the jury footage of the specific matches Lionel claimed to be imitating, demonstrating that none of the moves would have caused Tiffany's injuries. More damaging was the testimony from Dr. Heather Jarrell, a child psychiatrist who had examined Lionel. She testified that he showed clear signs of understanding that wrestling was fake entertainment, not real fighting. He knew the difference between play and violence, and he had deliberately chosen violence. Her evaluation revealed something even more disturbing. Lionel showed no empathy for his victim and demonstrated what she called callous disregard for the suffering of others. The prosecution's medical evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Ronald Wright, the medical examiner, spent hours walking the jury through Tiffany's injuries using detailed photographs and diagrams. He explained how each injury was inflicted, the amount of force required, and why the pattern of damage proved this was intentional violence, not accidental rough play. By the time he finished testifying, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Lionel's. But the most devastating moments came during the victim impact statements. Tiffany's mother, Louise Paul, took the stand wearing a t-shirt with her daughter's picture on it. Through tears, she described the little girl who would never dance again, never laugh again, never grow up to have a family of her own. She looked directly at Lionel and said, "You took my baby away from me. She was my heart, my soul, my everything. And you just threw her away like she was nothing." Tiffany's grandmother, Patricia Paul, spoke about having to explain to other family members why their precious little girl was never coming home. She talked about the funeral, about burying a 6-year-old child, about the nightmares that still haunted her every night. The entire courtroom was sobbing, but Lionel sat stone-faced, showing no emotion whatsoever. Even more shocking was what happened when Lionel finally took the stand in his own defense. His lawyers had coached him extensively on what to say, how to show remorse, how to appear like the innocent child they were claiming he was. But when he actually testified, the result was catastrophic for his case. Lionel's apology to Tiffany's family was so hollow, so clearly rehearsed, that it actually made things worse. "I'm sorry for what happened to Tiffany," he said in a flat, emotionless voice, like he was apologizing for breaking someone's favorite mug. There were no tears, no genuine emotion, no indication that he understood the magnitude of what he had done. He answered questions with the same arrogant tone he had used since the beginning. And when prosecutors pressed him on the details of his story, he became defensive and angry. The jury saw right through it all. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict, and their decision was unanimous. On March 9, 2001, they found Lionel Alexander Tate guilty of first-degree murder. The boy who thought his age made him untouchable was about to discover that some crimes are so horrible, so unforgivable that even children must face adult consequences. March 9, 2001, the day that would change juvenile justice forever and shatter a 13-year-old boy's delusions about his own invincibility. Judge Joel Lazarus had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that his decision would set a precedent that would be studied and debated for decades to come. The weight of history was on his shoulders as he prepared to sentence the youngest person ever convicted of first-degree murder in American history. The courtroom was absolutely packed that morning. Media from around the world had descended on Fort Lauderdale to witness this unprecedented moment. Tiffany's family filled the front rows, wearing t-shirts with her picture and preparing for what they hoped would be justice for their murdered little girl. Lionel's supporters, mostly family members who still believed in his innocence, sat on the opposite side, praying for mercy. But it was Lionel himself who commanded everyone's attention as he was led into the courtroom that final time. At 13, he had grown even taller and more intimidating than he was during the crime. But more than his physical presence, it was his attitude that shocked everyone. Even after being convicted of first-degree murder, even after hearing all the evidence against him, Lionel still carried himself with that same arrogant confidence that had defined him throughout the entire process. He sat at the defense table in his oversized suit, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but mostly just staring straight ahead with what witnesses later described as a smug expression. His mother, Kathleen, sat directly behind him, clutching a tissue and looking like she was about to collapse from stress. She still couldn't believe that her baby boy was about to be sentenced for murder. Judge Lazarus began the sentencing hearing by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case. He talked about the difficulty of balancing justice for the victim with mercy for such a young defendant. But then his tone shifted, and it became clear that he had made his decision based purely on the evidence and the law, not on sympathy for Lionel's age. "Lionel Alexander Tate," the judge said, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "you have been found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Tiffany Eunick. Before I impose sentence, I want you to understand exactly what you did and why you are here today." The judge then spent nearly 10 minutes detailing the evidence against Lionel, describing Tiffany's injuries in graphic detail, and explaining why the court rejected any claim that this was an accident. He spoke about the pattern of violence, the deliberate nature of the attack, and the complete lack of remorse Lionel had shown throughout the entire process. "The act that you committed was not the act of a typical 12-year-old child," Judge Lazarus continued, staring directly at Lionel. "What you did to Tiffany Eunick was cold, callous, and indescribably cruel. You showed no mercy to a helpless 6-year-old girl, and you have shown no genuine remorse for your actions." This was the moment when Lionel's confident facade began to crack. For the first time since the trial began, he seemed to realize that his age wasn't going to save him. His lawyers had probably prepared him for the possibility of juvenile detention, maybe even a few years in prison. But what came next was something none of them had truly expected. "It is the judgment of this court," Judge Lazarus announced, his words cutting through the courtroom like a blade, "that you be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The words "life without parole" hit Lionel like a physical blow. His mouth dropped open, his eyes went wide with shock, and for the first time since Tiffany's death, he showed real, genuine emotion. But it wasn't remorse or regret. It was pure disbelief and rage that his age hadn't protected him. "No," he shouted, jumping up from his chair so violently that it toppled over behind him. "That's not fair. I'm just a kid. You can't do this to me." His mother, Kathleen, let out a scream that could be heard throughout the courthouse and probably in the parking lot outside. "No, he's just a baby," she wailed, lunging toward the bench before court officers quickly moved to restrain her. "You're destroying my child." "He's just a baby." The defense table erupted into complete chaos. Jim Lewis, Lionel's attorney, was frantically trying to calm his client while simultaneously arguing with the judge about the sentence. Other family members in the courtroom began shouting and crying, creating a cacophony of grief and rage that threatened to turn the proceedings into a riot. But it was Lionel's breakdown that everyone would remember forever. As the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison began to sink in, he completely lost control. He started rocking back and forth in his chair, muttering, "This can't be happening, this can't be happening," over and over again like a mantra. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and sweat began pouring down his face as panic set in. Court officers moved in to restrain him as Lionel became increasingly agitated and violent. He tried to stand up again, shouting at the judge, "You don't understand. I didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident. I'm just a kid." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence had already proven that this was no accident. As officers prepared to lead him away, Lionel turned to look at his mother one last time. The boy who had been so confident, so sure that his age would protect him, now looked like exactly what he was, a terrified child who had just realized that his life was effectively over at age 13. "Mama, don't let them do this to me," he screamed as officers began to drag him toward the door. "I want to go home. I want to go home." His voice cracked with genuine terror as the full weight of his sentence finally hit him. The last thing the courtroom saw was Lionel being physically carried out by 4 court officers, still struggling and screaming, while his mother collapsed in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. In that moment, Lionel Alexander Tate became the youngest person in American history to receive life without parole, and his childhood was officially over forever. Judge Lazarus later said that it was the most difficult sentencing he had ever handed down, but that the evidence left him no choice. The crime was too brutal, the lack of remorse too complete, and the danger to society too great to justify anything less than life in prison. But this story doesn't end with that life sentence. And what happened next proves that Lionel's violent tendencies were never just a childhood phase that he would outgrow. The aftermath of his sentencing would reveal even more about his true character and show that some people are simply incapable of change. Regardless of second chances, immediately after the sentencing, Lionel's defense team filed appeals claiming that the sentence was unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment for someone so young. They argued that Lionel hadn't understood the charges against him when he rejected the original plea deal, and that trying a 12-year-old as an adult violated his constitutional rights. The case became a rallying cry for juvenile justice reform advocates who believed that children should never face adult penalties regardless of their crimes. For 3 long years, while Lionel sat in prison appealing his conviction, Tiffany's family had to relive their trauma over and over again. Every court hearing, every news story, every legal filing forced them to remember that their little girl was dead while her killer continued to fight for his freedom. Deweese Paul, Tiffany's mother, later said that the appeals process was almost as traumatic as losing her daughter in the first place. Then, in January 2004, Lionel got the break he had been hoping for. The 4th District Court of Appeal overturned his conviction in a 2-1 decision, ruling that there should have been a hearing to determine whether he was mentally competent to understand the charges and make informed decisions about his defense. The court said that given his age, his documented learning disabilities, and the complexity of the legal proceedings, it wasn't clear that Lionel truly understood what was happening when he rejected that plea deal. The decision was controversial and heartbreaking for Tiffany's family, but it opened the door for a new plea agreement. In March 2004, now 17 years old, Lionel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to the 3 years he had already served in prison, plus 1 year of house arrest and 10 years of probation. On January 26, 2004, Lionel Alexander Tate walked out of Broward County Jail a free man. He had served just over 3 years for beating a 6-year-old girl to death. The media coverage of his release was extensive, with reporters following him as he returned to his mother's house to begin his house arrest. Kathleen Tate told reporters that her son had learned his lesson and would never hurt anyone again. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like maybe the system had worked. Maybe Lionel really was just a child who had made a horrible mistake, and maybe rehabilitation was possible. His probation officer described him as cooperative and respectful. He completed his house arrest without incident. For over a year, everything seemed to be going well, but on May 23, 2005, everything fell apart again. 18-year-old Lionel Tate was arrested for armed robbery, accused of pulling a gun on a pizza delivery driver and stealing $40 and 4 pizzas. The crime was so petty, so stupid, and so completely unnecessary that it shocked everyone who had believed in his redemption. According to police reports, Lionel and a friend had ordered pizzas to an apartment complex in Pembroke Park. When 22-year-old Walter Galloway arrived with the delivery, Lionel approached him with a handgun, demanded money, and stole both the cash and the food. The robbery was caught on surveillance video, making denial impossible. The arrest was devastating for multiple reasons. Not only had Lionel committed another violent crime, but he had done so while still on probation for murder. Under the terms of his plea agreement, any new felony conviction would send him back to prison for decades. The young man who had been given a second chance at life had thrown it away for $40 and some pizza. During his arrest, Lionel showed the same arrogant attitude that had defined his behavior since childhood. Police reported that he seemed more annoyed about being caught than remorseful about the crime. When they asked him why he had risked his freedom for such a small amount of money, he just shrugged and said he needed cash. In 2006, Lionel pleaded guilty to the armed robbery charges and admitted to violating his probation. Judge Lazarus, the same judge who had originally sentenced him to life, was clearly disgusted by Lionel's inability to change. "You had every opportunity to make something of your life," the judge told him. "Instead, you chose to return to violence and crime." The sentence was harsh but predictable. 30 years in state prison for the probation violation, plus additional time for the robbery conviction. At age 19, Lionel Tate was going back to prison, this time likely for the rest of his adult life. Today, Lionel Alexander Tate remains incarcerated in the Florida state prison system. Now in his late 30s, he has spent most of his life behind bars for crimes committed as both a child and an adult. His earliest possible release date won't come until he's nearly 50 years old, assuming he serves his full sentence and doesn't commit any additional crimes while in prison. The tragedy extends beyond just Lionel's wasted life. Tiffany Eunick would be in her 30s now if she had lived. She would have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, possibly had children of her own. Instead, her life ended at age 6 because of one person's choice to use violence against someone who couldn't defend herself. What makes the Lionel Tate case so disturbing isn't just the crime itself, but what it reveals about the nature of violence, childhood development, and our justice system's struggle to deal with young killers. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about when children cross the line from innocent to dangerous, and whether some people are simply born with a capacity for violence that no amount of intervention can fix. Child psychologists who studied Lionel's case identified several red flags that were present long before he killed Tiffany. His pattern of targeting smaller, weaker victims wasn't random childhood aggression. It was predatory behavior that showed clear signs of what experts call callous unemotional traits. These are characteristics often seen in adult psychopaths, but they can manifest in children as young as elementary school age. Dr. Heather Jarrell, who evaluated Lionel during his trial, noted that he showed an unusual lack of empathy for his victim and seemed genuinely confused about why people were so upset about Tiffany's death. This wasn't the normal remorse and guilt you would expect from a child who had accidentally hurt someone. Instead, Lionel seemed to view Tiffany's death as an inconvenience that was interfering with his life. Even more troubling was his complete inability to take responsibility for his actions. Throughout the trial, appeals process, and even after his release, Lionel maintained that he was the real victim in this situation. He consistently portrayed himself as a misunderstood child who was being unfairly punished for an accident, never acknowledging that his choices had killed an innocent little girl. The wrestling defense that his lawyers used reveals another disturbing aspect of his personality, his willingness to manipulate the truth to avoid consequences. Multiple witnesses testified that Lionel knew wrestling was fake, yet he maintained his story about innocently copying what he saw on TV. This wasn't confused child logic. It was calculated deception designed to avoid responsibility for his actions. What happened after his release proves that Lionel's violent tendencies weren't just a phase he would outgrow. The armed robbery that sent him back to prison showed the same pattern of behavior, targeting a vulnerable victim, a lone delivery driver, using violence to get what he wanted, and showing no genuine remorse when caught. It suggests that his capacity for violence was always part of his core personality, not something that could be fixed with therapy or rehabilitation. This case also highlights the incredible difficulty our justice system faces when dealing with child killers. On one hand, we have a fundamental belief that children are different from adults, that they're less capable of understanding consequences, more likely to be rehabilitated, and deserving of second chances. On the other hand, some crimes are so brutal and some young offenders show such clear signs of dangerous personality traits that protecting society becomes the primary concern. The fact that Lionel was offered a 3-year sentence shows that the system was trying to balance these competing interests. 3 years for murder seems shockingly lenient, but for a 12-year-old offender, it represented a significant portion of his childhood and adolescence. The problem was that Lionel and his family were so convinced of his innocence that they rejected even this generous offer, gambling everything on complete acquittal. The media attention surrounding this case also influenced how it played out. The sensational nature of the crime, a child killer, wrestling violence, a life sentence, made it irresistible to news outlets. But the constant coverage may have made it harder for both sides to reach reasonable compromises, as public opinion and media pressure pushed everyone toward more extreme positions. Today, the Lionel Tate case is studied in law schools and criminal justice programs as an example of how difficult it can be to balance juvenile justice with public safety. Some experts argue that his original life sentence was appropriate given the brutality of the crime and his obvious lack of remorse. Others contend that no child should ever face adult penalties, regardless of what they've done. What everyone agrees on is that this case revealed serious failures in our system for identifying and helping troubled children before they commit serious crimes. Lionel's pattern of aggressive behavior was known to teachers, parents, and other adults in his community, but no one intervened effectively. If someone had recognized the warning signs and gotten Lionel proper psychological help, Tiffany Eunick might still be alive today. So here we are at the end of this horrific story, and I want you to really think about the questions this case raises, because they don't have easy answers. Was Lionel Tate a misguided child who made a terrible mistake and deserved a second chance? Or was he a calculating predator who just happened to be 12 years old when he committed his first murder?